Do you know the stomach-churning facts that happen to women on slave breeding farms? As the sun rose, their tough day began. They woke up on cold dirt floors, getting ready for hard work. They were watched and sometimes heard by people called overseers. But why did America keep slaves when others said no? The reason is shocking. America found a way to have more slaves without buying them from other countries. How? By making them have children. This choice led to very sad times in history. You'll hear stories of pain, hope, and survival. Stories of women who faced horrors and of people who found strength in music, stories, and faith. Curious about their stories? Then stick around. It's a journey you won't forget. Let's start with some background information. In the early days of America's growth, the rise of the sun signaled another day of labor for enslaved people. They woke on dirt floors, facing the certainty of grueling work until sunset. An overseer who could be cold or violent often watched them. As the rest of the Western world moved against slavery, the U.S. chose to maintain it. Why? Because when the international slave trade stopped, American landowners started breeding slaves domestically. This decision led to one of the darkest chapters in American history. Life on a U.S. plantation was really hard for enslaved people. They lost their dignity and their basic rights, but the way they were treated could be different based on many things. Most slaves worked in fields from morning to night. They did this 6 days a week. Food wasn't always guaranteed. Sometimes the food they got was so bad that even animals wouldn't dare to eat it. Some slaves on smaller farms didn't even get food at all. Their homes were simple shacks. These shacks often had just dirt floors. There was no furniture inside, so living in them was both tough and uncomfortable. Violence was a big problem as well. Many slaves lived in fear of the people in charge. They could be hurt or punished at any time. Violence was an ever-present danger, mostly at the hands of overseers. These overseers had one main job: to make sure slaves worked hard. This often resulted in cruelty and violence. Overseers had power on plantations, making sure slaves worked hard. On big farms, overseers were common. Many scary stories from the past talk about them. Their main job was to get as much work from slaves as possible. The more the slaves worked, the more overseers got paid. Because of this, they could be really harsh. They would do almost anything to make sure that slaves worked faster. This is why many people remember overseers as mean and often drunk, hurting slaves a lot. But the truth is a bit more complicated. The overseer was stuck in the middle. On one side, the farm owner wanted a lot of work done to make more money. On the other side, the slaves needed to be okay to work, so it was a tough job for the overseer too. It's hard to imagine how slaves, overworked and underfed, could ever be content with all of this. Why would they work harder when they weren't treated like humans? The overseers had a tough job, and they were all different. Some overseers were young men, sons of farm owners. They wanted to learn how to run a farm for their future. Others wanted to climb the ladder and become farm owners one day. These were the main types of overseers. Then, there were some who were mean and often drunk. They seemed to enjoy being cruel. But overseers didn't usually keep their jobs for long. Even in a system that treated slaves so badly, there was a limit to how much cruelty was okay. The farm owners saw slaves as valuable. If an overseer was too harsh, he would lose his job. The role of the driver shows how twisted slavery was. A driver was like an overseer, but they were slaves. This means that farm owners picked a slave to be in charge of other farms. This made things even more complicated. Farm owners would tell a driver they could get special treats if they made other slaves work harder. But this also meant other slaves might not trust the driver. Balancing this was very hard. How could a driver keep the respect of other slaves and also please the farm owner? Many say that other slaves didn't like drivers, yet records show the drivers kept their jobs longer than overseers. They often did a better job running the farm. Some slaves might have thought that a driver, being one of them, would be kinder, but it's also clear that many slaves didn't like them. Stories from slaves also tell us about the harsh realities they faced. Some were even forced to have children. Slavery had many dark moments, but the breeding farms were among the worst. As the world began to see how wrong slavery was, America couldn't just stop. This was because around 1820, the US relied heavily on 1.5 million slaves. These slaves worked on farms that grew crops like cotton and tobacco. These crops made a lot of money for the country. Since buying slaves from other countries became unpopular, US farm owners had an idea. They decided to breed slaves in America. This meant more slaves were born within the country, so even without buying from outside, the number of slaves grew quickly. By 1860, that number rose to about 4 million. States like Maryland and Virginia had the biggest farms for this. They produced many slaves that were sent to work in the South. As we delve into the dark history of breeding farms, the horrors faced by enslaved women stand out. Edward Franklin Fraser wrote about how slaves were treated. He said they were treated like animals. They were used for work and for making more slaves, just like animals are used for making more livestock. Maggie Stenhouse, another person who wrote about slavery, talked about stockmen. These were men who were slaves. They were chosen for their size and health. It was like how farmers choose the best animals to breed. These stockmen were then put in a room with women. The farm owners wanted these women to have babies. When this happened, the men were called bucks and the women were called breeders. The women had no choice. They were forced into this. The goal was to have more babies who would become slaves. The way this happened was really hard on the women. They were chosen when they were very young. Many of them started having babies when they were still almost kids themselves. There were stories about a woman who was only 22 but already had 7 kids. Another was just 19 and had 4 kids. After giving birth, these women had very little time to rest. They were expected to be pregnant again in just a few months. Their lives were really hard. They had to go through the pain of pregnancy and birth, and then they had to get ready to do it all over again. They were used and abused. They didn't have any say in what happened to their bodies at all. To make things even worse, these women often didn't get to keep their babies. Their kids were taken away from them. They were used to make the farm owners richer. These women lost so much in the process. They lost the right to own their bodies, they lost their children, as well as their freedom. This part of history is very dark. It's hard to even think about it, but it's important to remember and understand. The women who were used this way faced things that most people can't even imagine. How did these slaves handle such tough times? Their strength shows in the stories and songs they shared. They leaned on each other for help and comfort. They sang songs and told stories to remember where they came from. Faith was big for them. They believed in a better place after this life. They also felt that someone up above was looking out for them. As a result, this gave them hope. In conclusion, the history of slave breeding farms in the US unveils a bleak and painful chapter. It's a story that needs to be told and understood, not just for the sake of history, but to foster empathy and ensure that such horrors are never repeated. Thank you so much for watching this video, and don't forget to leave a comment down below and let us know what you thought about this topic. See you next time, and bye for now.